1953. I am gonna start with Stalinism. The history of the Soviet Union between 1927 and 1953 covers the period of the Second World War and a victory against Nazi Germany while the USSR remained under the control of Joseph Stalin. Stalin sought to destroy his political rivals while transforming Soviet society with central planning, in particular a collectivization of agriculture and a development of heavy industry. Stalin's power within the party and the state was established and eventually evolved into Stalin's cult of personality, Soviet secret police, and the mass mobilization. The Communist Party was one of Stalin's major tools in molding the Soviet society. Stalin's methods in achieving his goals, which included party purges, political repression of the general population, and forced collectivization, led to millions of deaths in gulags during the man-made famines and ethnic cleansings through forced resettlements of population. World War II, known as the Great Patriotic War in the Soviet Union, devastated much of the USSR with about 1 out of every 3 World War II deaths representing a citizen of the Soviet Union. After World War II, the Soviet Union's armies occupied Central and Eastern Europe, where socialist governments took power. By 1949, the Cold War had started between the Western Bloc and the Eastern Soviet Bloc, with the Warsaw Pact pitched against NATO in Europe. After 1945, Stalin did not directly engage in any wars. Stalin continued his totalitarian rule in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc until his death in 1953, moving towards Khrushchev Thaw during 1953 to 1964. In the Soviet Union, the 11-year period from the death of Joseph Stalin, 1953, to the political ouster of Nikita Khrushchev, 1964, the national politics were dominated by the Cold War, the ideological USSR struggle for the planetary domination of their respective socio-economic systems, and the defense of hegemonic spheres of influence. Nonetheless, since the mid-1950s, despite the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, CPSU, having disowned Stalinism, the political culture of Stalinism, an omnipotent general secretary, anti-Trotskyism, a 5-year planned economy, post-new economic policy, and repudiation of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact secret protocols remained the character of Soviet society until the accession of Mikhail Gorbachev as leader of the CPSU in 1985. Era of Stagnation, 1964 to 1982. The history of the Soviet Union from 1964 to 1982, referred to as the Brezhnev era, covers the period of Leonid Brezhnev's rule of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. This period began with high economic growth and soaring prosperity, but ended with a much weaker Soviet Union facing social, political, and economic stagnation. The average annual income stagnated because needed economic reforms were never fully carried out. Nikita Khrushchev was ousted as first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, CPSU, as well as chairman of the Council of Ministers on October 14, 1964, due to his failed reforms and disregard for party and government institutions. Brezhnev replaced Khrushchev as first secretary and Alexei Kosygin replaced him as chairman of the Council of Ministers. Anastas Mikoyan and later Nikolai Podgorny became chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet. Together with Andrei Kirilenko as organizational secretary and Mikhail Suslov as chief ideologue, they made up a reinvigorated collective leadership which contrasted in form with the autocracy that characterized Khrushchev's rule. The collective leadership first set out to stabilize the Soviet Union and calm Soviet society, a task which they were able to accomplish. In addition, they attempted to speed up economic growth, which had slowed considerably during Khrushchev's last years in power. In 1965, Kosygin initiated several reforms to decentralize the Soviet economy. After initial success in creating economic growth, hardliners within the party halted the reforms, fearing that they would weaken the party's prestige and power. No other radical economic reforms were carried out during the Brezhnev era, and economic growth began to stagnate in the early to mid-1970s. By Brezhnev's death in 1982, Soviet economic growth had, according to several historians, nearly come to a standstill. The stabilization policy brought about after Khrushchev's removal established a ruling gerontocracy, and political corruption became a normal phenomenon. Brezhnev, however, never initiated any large-scale anti-corruption campaigns due to the large military buildup. Of the 1960s, the Soviet Union was able to consolidate itself as a superpower during Brezhnev's rule. The era ended with Brezhnev's death on November 10, 1982. While all modernized economies were rapidly moving to computerization after 1965, the USSR fell further and further behind. Moscow's decision to copy the IBM/360 of 1965 proved a decisive mistake, for it locked scientists into a system they were unable to improve, so that it gradually became antiquated. They had enormous difficulties in manufacturing the necessary chips reliably and in quantity, in programming workable and efficient programs, in coordinating entirely separate operations, and in providing support to computer users. One of the greatest strengths of Soviet economy was its vast supplies of oil and gas. World oil prices quadrupled during the 1973-74 oil crisis and rose again in 1979-1981, making the energy sector the chief driver of the Soviet economy, and was used to cover multiple weaknesses. At one point, Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin told the head of oil and gas production, "Things are bad with bread. Give me 3 million tons of oil over the plan." 9. Former Prime Minister Yegor Gaidar, an economist looking back 3 decades, in 2007, wrote, "The hard currency from oil exports stopped the growing food supply crisis, increased the import of equipment and consumer goods, ensured a financial base for the arms race and the achievement of nuclear parity with the United States, and permitted the realization of such risky foreign policy actions as the war in Afghanistan."